Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody for the lecture of Preston Scott Cohen, who I think is pretty famous, judging from the attendance of the audience. He is chair of architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and in this function he's the successor of Walter Gropius, Harry Cobb, Mrs. Mori, and also Neo. And okay, I forget some people. I'm sorry. Ever since he published, or his book Contested Symmetries was published in 2001, I think all the students in our school, at least in the studio where I was teaching, were aware of somebody who tried to really do magnificent things with geometry. Not forgetting that architecture is a kind of contested territory between what people call building and what architecture as a philosophical discipline is. It would mean architecture is reflecting on what it is doing itself. And when I think Preston Scott Cohen is talking about his buildings, he will also mention where his buildings or his speculations are located. He did a lot of remarkable buildings, and I'm not naming them. I wouldn't be able to do it, and which all came out as results of international competition. So it is somebody who is, I would say, a person or an architect who is pretty aware of what the discipline is, uses geometry as one of the generative moments, but also puts it into the service of what real life is or real economy is, and in this way is pretty successful in winning big international competitions. I welcome Preston Scott Cohen.
Thank you. First, maybe the lights are a little lower. Is it possible? But anyway, well, thank you so much to the Institute of Architecture for welcoming me to this. Well, I would just like to thank Rhino Zetzels because he has taken the afternoon with me, and we had what was one of the most lively and exciting conversations I've had in quite some time, as we wandered through some beautiful bars in the city. Not drinking very much. He put my mind actually on a lecture that I will be giving in a few weeks, and I'm a little bit actually distracted by it. It's very exciting. But meanwhile, I will turn my attention to what I hope to show you today. As he had mentioned, the question of drawing had been important to me, and I thought I would introduce some ideas around this topic. So, and then, well, indeed show some new projects. So it comes together. But anyway, well, what I'm going to begin with is an idea trying to pull together, to bridge between two domains that we do not often see together, two modes of thought and action, potentially not seen often together. On the one hand, the role of drawing versus computation, this question, this set of issues around that problem, those two mediums. And on the other hand, the role of urbanism in shaping the plan at the scale of architecture. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how these two come together. Two dialectics, we could say. So let me begin first making a few comments. I think it's useful to go back and to make a few observations to do this about representation in architecture. Now, rather than proceeding by claiming that the computer had, let's say, displaced drawing, that's one of its most radical consequences for architecture, it seems to me more important to assess whether or not other developments in architectural history displaced drawing prior to the computer, and to understand what these might mean for this, what I regard the most persistent form of architectural representation to this day, namely the plan. First, it's necessary to distinguish between drawing as a medium of communication, as picture making, let's say, from drawing as a means to produce form through geometry, and thereby be a sort of an instrument with which to, let's say, construct the architectural project. Interestingly, much of architecture, even its plans and sections, have been conceived of the way drawing is very often. Pictures, are. And that is directly without the use of geometric principles, without the constraints of geometry. And yet plans in particular involve projection, the enactment of extrusion. Let's go all the way back to the origins of representation now for a moment, and we see that the plan was executed directly at full scale. Gothic buildings were drawn on the ground with ropes, and when the plans were drawn at another scale, as we see here, with a stylus on wax tablets or on parchment, what did they represent? They represented neither the ropes on the ground, nor the idea that the lines would extrude. They only represented how the ground would be organized and allocate space, in order to allocate space. So architectural drawing was not related to geometry or the enactment of geometry. Only later would perspective, a foundation of the projective geometry, be considered to be an advanced form of drawing. But what I would like to focus on now, and what is perhaps the most important, what is most important for the role that projection as opposed to picture drawing plays in architecture, is the foundational principle for perspective projection, known as sectioning. What I would argue is that with perspective came a profound redefinition of what the plan is. There is a world of difference between the pre-perspective plan and the plan after perspective. From then on, plans are implicitly derived from cutting through something as opposed to drawing upon a surface. It was during the Renaissance, as you know, that we actually saw the principles of perspective formalized. The demand for realism and the alliance of mathematics and nature motivated this invention, as you know, too. And it is basically a transference of points in space to a surface, rays that are sliced by a plane. It is that moment of cutting, that act of slicing through rays, which produces the matrix of points which are connected to one another, makes the image that we call the perspective. In the 17th century, Desargues combined the sectioning of solids with perspective representation. The transference of the object from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions on the section cutting plane, and brings into coincidence the drawing of true and apparent shapes, thereby describing an object and the image of an object simultaneously. Here we can see how he's cutting the object and generating a perspective of part of it by virtue of that slice. And I, for a number of years, was preoccupied with this transference, with this shift, with this continuous transformation between the illusion of architecture through its perspective and the inflation of that into a third dimension condition. But what I would like to do now is to talk further about how we get to the question of the plan. Here we have Sangallo. Before and after the age of perspective and sectioning, buildings were designed and drawn in 2 dimensions, both in elevation and in section, and were assumed only to extrude empirically, not by projective means. Now, later we find, concurrent to this, we of course have a different discipline, that of geometry playing a role, the definition of building construction through stereotomy. a field that was not undertaken normally by architects, a field of knowledge not normally used by architects as a principle of design. A rare exception came with Bermonte, this church, Sensato, whereby, owing to a problematic situation in the site at the rear of the church, that's where the street was, it was impossible for him to build the plan that he was required to build, a centralized plan. Precluded from being able to build it, he built it with projection. And anamorphosis takes the place of this part of the plan drawn in red and produces it illusory. And so he brings to bear this technique to manifest, as I said, the plan. This would be the first moment where you see the idea of urbanism, the circumstance being combined with the question of projection very explicitly. Interestingly enough, this is a moment where you have painting, which is a very particular condition in which painting behaves something like architecture. It asks an occupant to be placed in a particular way in space in order to understand it. And moving from one place to another, as you know, with anamorphosis, one is basically seeing a change. Normally, as you know with perspective, it's assumed that we view it from a frontal position. And anamorphosis is something like superimposing an oblique onto a frontal view. And thereby, in the process of change, we come to recognize the elasticity of vision and the object. Another very rare exception occurs when Peruzzi, for the first time, really that we know, uses perspective to represent the plan explicitly as a section, as a horizontal section. As I said previously, buildings have been drawn by hand, and there are occasions that are partly cut away, but the idea that you would actually show for the first time the plan as a section was something new. Interestingly, what this would mean is that the building is preconceived. It's conceived, of course, prior to the plan. The plan is an after effect of cutting. Now let's leap very drastically to a much later principle of the plan. The plan as generator. This plan is, in a way, a different kind of revolutionary idea, because it is more Gothic than the Renaissance plan in the sense that it is not projective. Generative, not via only projection, let's say, implicit arising through extrusion, but rather generative, let's say, of an evolving and developing composition. This was something else altogether, but I would say still closer to the Gothic idea than the Renaissance idea of the plan. Now, another radical shift, or let's say parallel phenomenon to this one, is at the deepest level implicitly more Renaissance. And that would be the idea of modern space, which piles up what I have called successive architecture. The stacking up of so many plans, all of them a manifestation of an object that's preconceived. They are merely horizontal slices. In one sense, they're quite different than either the Renaissance and the plan as generator. None of them are consequential more so than the other. None are generative in any profound way. None are the one and only that somehow can be thought to capture the principle of the building, as would be the case, for example, in Peruzzi, where the plan is authorized as a kind of originary agent. Now the plan is only, as I said, after, and of no particular generative consequence. This is a very different idea, yet another model, and it will lead us to our contemporary plan, the plan, the result, the plan as an after image, of an object preconceived. But this is a different paradigm still than the New York, than the skyscraper, than the successive plan. Because this plan is a constantly changing. I call it the anatomical plan. It's something like sectioning through a human figure, or organic figure, and thereby representing this continuous change, a kind of narrative transformational kind of idea. Here is a pre-computational stereotomic plan building, my favorite of those. Now, it should be noted that when the plan is an afterimage, when the plan is sliced through the preconceived, and the preconceived generates a continuously changing figure, we are certainly outside the question of anamorphosis. We can't any longer be tied back to the time of the elastic, which involved a different kind of motion only of the subject, and not a continuous transforming object. This particular case also is quite rare in architecture, as you know. Despite our fascination with it today in the Academy, very few buildings have anatomical plans, although almost all of the plans the students do. It's the rarest of the plans. Now, this kind of condition of inversion interests me in one sense. And I would say the following, that I'd like to now leap and try to make a new hypothesis, that it would be better, and perhaps more productive, to move out of the discussion of painting, painterly anamorphosis, of the origins of the plans and these modes of the drawing, into another kind of animal analog, into a different kind of, let's say, parallel. And that would be, and this may seem a little bit literal, please bear with me, into the filmic medium. The filmic medium is very didactic for us when thinking about the anatomical plan. That is because the anatomical plan, as I said, is a continuous transformation, and in that sense, in its constant change, is quite linear. Of course, this building is relentlessly linear. But regardless of that, so too is its formal transformation when seen through successive plan slices. And so we have here something like a continuously developing narrative, a generative narrative type film. Interestingly, by the way, if we continue with this idea, and we can see other manifestations of this kind of slicing of multiple plans that when all together seem are a continuously transforming figure. As I said, being the most radical of plan typologies. Look at this moment, which is the most beautiful one in the room. Excuse me, right in there. It is just the opposite, of course, of the prior model that I explained, the successive plan type, the more common, the one that's always omnipresent, the ubiquitous plan of our period. The most radical of plans in architecture, the anatomical plan, is the most conventional in the world of film, the continuous narrative, that which moves. Whereas this plan, the plan of the 20th century tower, is perhaps analogous, if we were to continue this parallel to the filmic medium, to a different idea. I think it's reasonable to continue the analogy with film, owing to the fact that it is a plan that comes after, but one of absolutely no generative authority, and thereby merely one of many fixed frames. These plans could be, as you know, if we were to see any of these plans in this building, little of any consequence would be different from one frame to another. If we continue to just go 100 plans in a row here, we would see little happening. Here, the World Trade Center plan. An elevator might come and go. A bathroom might be reshaped. Of course, things come in and out of these plans, all partitions and temporary arrangements. But in essence, we're looking at a plan that of little difference from one to the next. And if we did make the analogy of film, it would have to be to this kind of film, the structuralist film. This is Warhol's film Sleep, of a man sleeping, his boyfriend sleeping for more than 5 hours. An audience enduring almost unendurable boredom and throwing things at the screen angrily, having expected a great film from Warhol. Enduring what was really a single photo, nearly something almost like looking at a single photograph for 5 hours, Here we have again something like what happens with Bramante. In Bramante we have architecture imitating the moment when painting imitated architecture. We have that. We have architecture imitating the moment when painting imitated architecture. Because painting, by enacting anamorphosis, demands the subject in space. Here we have slicing through this tower. Look at the flicker effect, by the way. This is only an accident. If you continue to slice through a plan of a building, you will see that as it slices through the solid slabs, it will appear to flicker. Well, this was an accident, but a fortuitous one, which makes it even closer to Warhol. It introduces the flicker effect as a kind of mode of introducing a kind of anachronistic character to the film. This is part of the polemic of those structural films. But leaving that whole thing aside, what most interests me about the analogy between sleep and a skyscraper is the inertness, the inactivity, the fact of stillness in the repetition, the imitation of one medium in another with still shot in the motion picture. There are many things, and finally the most important of all, distracted inattention. That is, that the film was becoming architecture by virtue of demanding that the audience not pay attention or have their mind wander away from it. Unlike narrative film, which draws attention to it. Of course, the Guggenheim draws our attention to it. Yokohama Port Terminal draws attention to it. Many of my buildings do that too. The anatomical building will always draw attention to itself. Whereas the skyscraper, in its repetition, probably is more so preconditioned as background and as the kind of inattention, the object of inattention. This is what happens with Warhol, in a way he's moving film into architecture. So the skyscraper is already in architecture. Where does it go? Let me also, let's say, extend to another very important film. It happens to be of the same year. Chris Marker's film, La Jetée. La Jetée is a film of stills in sequence, successively, remaining for a time longer than a still shot, than a single shot normally would in a film. There is no motion in this film. There's just a succession of still shots until, except for one segment. There is one motion picture segment in La Jetée, which clearly, didactically, represents, with its being an exception, the convention, the non-conventional narrative film within what is really a time travel film. The narrative is a kind of time travel with a sequence of independent cuts out of discontinuous temporal kind of narratives. So we have here, in the editing, in this idea of montage film, an idea that relates potentially to, well, let's say it represents the idea of the frame as something we can now identify as part of narrative construction. This is quite different than the sleep, where we do not see the frame, since we only see one image almost throughout. Actually, Empire is the movie where we actually only see one thing, whereas there are breaks in sleep. Okay, there is one building which I think best manifests the montage as a type, the idea of La Jetée in a building, and that is this one, Karlsruhe, the Mediatek building, never built, 1989, of Koolhaas OMA. So this is not sleep. This is something that goes well beyond sleep. What he did is pile up, as many of you know, a series of Varendale trusses alternating with open spaces, so open areas which are not structured. So you can see that in the section, but what really is interesting is what we get in the plans. Think of La Jetée and look at this. Here we have the time travel of architecture, a pile up of multiple buildings, one on top of another. We have this kind of plan. Look at the top of it, at that moment of symmetry. Kind of strange classicistic plan, almost. The plans are bifurcated in those instances. is now we have a kind of Miesian, directional but open, single open space plan. Something where the mutation of the structure by expanding and contracting gives a kind of elastic definition to the space. Perhaps this is the most contemporary of the plans in that sense. Completely centralized void plan. Again, a bifurcation, but divided in the Corbusian sort of free plan way with the promenade. And how about that one? The Thalos. The hypostyle hall, my favorite. So here we have the time travel of architecture in one building. We have successive stacking, not in the most conventional way manifest as it would have been in Chicago and New York plans, one after another identical, but in the most exceptional and anomalous way, in the way that Koolhaas found in the athletic club. This is architecture manifesting itself according to this paradigm in the most explicit and self-conscious way. This paradigm of the plan fascinates me probably the most, and now, dangerously, having given this preamble, I will comment briefly on how these plan paradigms manifest themselves in a few of my projects. But probably, owing to the fact that I can't do it convincingly all of the time, I will digress, unfortunately, in other matters occasionally. And Tel Aviv is probably the building where I best manifest the question of the paradigms of time. I believe it's actually a building which probably could be defined as, at some very deep level, Corbusian. But most explicitly and most interestingly, I hope, it is both an anatomical, it is, let's say, an anatomically planned building, which by virtue of this continuity that the anatomical form offers, allows for a new manifestation of legité. Let me show you why I think that's true. There are other, we'll get to that in a moment, there are other things about it that I think are significant vis-a-vis this problematic. This might go back to an earlier and older model, the anamorphosis. Take, for example, the fact that the building is very horizontally attenuated at its facade. Stretched out, we'll discover that this stretched out form is the same form as a light well within the building that is verticalized. And we will experience this transition from extreme horizontality to verticality upon entering the building. A rather normal lobby, rather commodious but not extremely high dimension. And then this plunging depth is discovered here midway through what is a tall, almost vertiginous light well, twisting, and as I said, defined by these leaning, these skewed voids, which are of the same nature as the parallelogram you saw on the facade. The facade is the horizontally attenuated version of this vertical space, the inside-out kind of dialectic of a roughened, coarse exterior version of this smooth, almost, let's say, dimensionally inscrutable kind of Anish-Kapoorish spatiality. This transformation, first, should cue us into the fact that we're in a kind of synthetic in-between, perhaps of a building that operates according to two different models. And as I said, or as I did not point out, excuse me, in the Koolhaas what we have is this continuous extruded envelope that is entirely contained in a kind of cubic form. And in that continuity we have what we have in film, what we have in sleep, the succession, the linearity. It's in that way, by the gestalt of the continuity of his envelope, that he's able to make so evident the difference of all of those plans piling up. The envelope stays the same. The plans change so much. This is not operating that way. The envelope is twisted. It's the anatomical form. And the interior is too. But what happens here is a stacking of a different nature than in Koolhaas. Here we are at the top plan. The two rims rather orthogonally disposed. They were supposed to be completely orthogonal, but a giant truss disallowed that along the front end of number 12, as you can see. Turns out to be a good thing for other reasons, but I won't, for architectural reasons too, but leave that out. What I really want to point out is that the whole of this plan is dominated, let's say, by that particular arrangement of the two orthogonal galleries. And by the way, all of the building is slightly skewed relative to the existing building to the right. The outside of the whole building has turned slightly like a giant heavy wheel, barely. But the inside, at a far more accelerated rate, will rotate. And that is owing to the light fall, the space in the center. Look at the plan immediately below this one. And it is turned 22.5 degrees. There is nothing extruded in the main spaces in front of the core plan, part of the plan where the elevators are. Everything in front of that is quite different between these two plans. Only the stair binds them. If you pay close attention to this, you will see this stair. Here we are in a plan where the deep axis moves through the entire building all the way to a window here at the rear. Whereas in what's incidental to the plan, which is a small hole right here, a triangular void in the ceiling, turns out that this limit line of that cutout that allows the stair to move through, this limit line here, this edge that I'm trying to trace, is part of the predominant geometry of this plan above. What's minor to one is primary to the other. Anyway, this twisting, this rotation, this piling up of plans finally to 45 degree at the far left end of this, the last of these, the main axes, reconciles the building with its site, basically a triangle, reconciles the fact that we have to contain orthogonal galleries with the highest level of flexibility within that triangle. Draws light, by the way, this light fall into a building that's half underground. It does all of those things, but I think most interestingly, one discovers in this building that the building is turning under one's feet as one moves through it, and this discontinuity disorients even as we can find our way through. It's not a building anyone would ever get lost in, because the central space is an orientation device always gone back to, and the sequence around it will take us through. But which way we have turned, knowing one's moorings, well, that might be destabilized by this experience. Oops. And there you see the piles. The structure is literally piled. So it's not, it is deep structure. There are variandials here as well that allow for these rotations, and thereby not to have extrusion dominate columns that move from one foot to the other will not thereby dominate the heart of the museum. They're not deep plenums here. Most of the mechanical space is let through so that there are no deep plenums, so that when one moves from one floor to the next, it's quite surprising to have all of it be so differently oriented and organized within that different orientation. So there is a kind of shock that is experienced when one moves from one plan to the other. And you can see here how these rotations manifest. The parallelogram here, this one here, this void, goes under us here, all the way, and is parallel in plan to this one. So that in plan is parallel to that plan. And then below that still is another pair of voids, this one and another one under here. So you see the top two are also trouble not letting this force a change of slides. This is parallel in plan to this. These are the two top galleries I was showing you, these flexible rectangular spaces subdivided, curated independently, and free of the contortions of the architecture. This is an important problem, to have this dialectic play out between the anatomical and the neutral spaces that stack up normally to make normal rooms, flexible rooms. Here you can see manifestation of that rotation in the area beyond, and in the library again it manifests itself. There the dialectic is most clear. From the Guggenheim, it takes up everything, and makes utterly tyrannically linear the whole experience, offering the curator no independent freedom. Architecture here, in the Tel Aviv case, determines the plan. It's generative of it. In fact, these are hyperbolic parabolas, and they have as their generators straight lines, the edges, the straight edges of the rectangular galleries. They are the generators. But it leaves them alone, unfettered. It allows for a dialectic. It's apart from, at the same time, that it generates. So in that sense, the connection of Corbusier is interesting, but it doesn't tell the whole story. That the galleries come more so out of this fact of stacking the structures. Though this void we're looking through here into the light well is parallel to the void beyond it, they're not parallel in section. They're only parallel in plan. So it would appear that the void beyond is an oblique opening. We can't thereby, once again, understand the orthogonal constructs being piled. It's another kind of, let's say, a deceiver. Here's one of the views one can get. Displacing of plants. Another building with an anatomical kind of principle is this museum in Taiwan. Here, though not constrained by site, like Tel Aviv was, the promenade passing through, threading through this building animates it, and is independent of the promenade inside. The two seen against each other, interestingly motivate all of that. So this is a building that has to construct a park, participate in constructing a park. So its illusions are dedicated to much more distant and arbitrary perspectives. This was the clearest day we could ever have had in this city, though they are cleaning the air with the landscapes they are building. They are enormous scale landscapes, such as this one. The building clearly, I believe, is probably more evidently dedicated to the anatomical premise, though within it, it also collects orthogonal galleries. Most anatomical of all the projects, and this is a new one, a competition for a museum, a maritime museum in Tianjin. But you'll see here, in an inverse way, one of the things that I'm interested in, in Tel Aviv and in Taiwan is the constraint of the straight line, the constraint of the ubiquitous orthogonal, acting against, teamed against the free forms that then are teamed again by being analyzed, made into discrete flat parts. But nonetheless, the curvature, let's say going against them, something anatomical against what with vegetate, one something not so clear, and tell you something else. Here we see it again, but nested. Look at these two forms, and in a way, at their heart is the most regimented moment of the building, the crossing of these straight planes, these edges of normal planes. In a way, the very heart of the building is the most, as I said, disciplined, and the peripheral parts are the least and most engaged with a kind of freer conception. So this is kind of an inversion of the Tel Aviv problem. A much more continuous development of the plan happens within this. We don't have here the rotation of the plans piling and rotating. And so if we were to do those slices, which I should for you, we would just see something on the envelope relating to the Guggenheim of New York idea. And on the inside, something rather more normative, more Corbusian, ramps coming and going. This is an opera house we just won the competition for in Binghu. What is interesting here, and maybe not so evident by looking at it now this way, is that it combines two disagreeing geometries, hyperbolic parabolas and hyperbolas of revolution. The generators of these two and the behavior of these two types are difficult to put together and to control in such a way that they will make a shape that closes, much less a shape that will not spring into extreme obliques and curvatures that are impossible to house a building in. And it is the tension between these two that produces what seems like something, let's say, arrested in its curvature, or something constrained inherently. Even if this is subtle, it's not the free curve that moves without discipline. And I believe that somehow distinguishes it. I hope it will. You can see there also the advantage that these are developable and thereby constructible in a very efficient way. All of these surfaces that I use are. And another which we recently won contingent on bringing in a cost estimate that is reasonable is this, a science center in a city called Hefei. So this is the, I'm going through the whole Chinese series here. These are, again, hyperbolas of revolution. But in this case, something strange happens with this globe, which is the planetarium inside. As it orbits implicitly in the building, establishing this path horizontally around the building that spirals. What should I say about it more than that? There isn't much more to say. Relative to the plan problem, there isn't. I could tell other stories about these buildings, but at this particular moment, they aren't really interesting. Let's just look at this one. Now, I'll return to some of these earlier narratives by showing a different kind of project. I'm always compelled to reflect again on these questions of concerning drawing and the anamorphosis and projective geometry, because they somehow synthesize the tension between curvature and the orthogonal, as I said, ubiquitous orthogonal, which is one of the topics I'm most dedicated to investigating. This is a house on the left that was developed at the moment I was discovering so much the whole projective apparatus of Des-Largues theorem. And on the right, a new house, looking somewhat like it, but brought about by very different means. What interested me most about Bramante's church was that it was mandated to solve a problem which required him to bring to bear this invention, which produced the imitation of painting when it was imitating architecture. You see, it wasn't only voluntarily brought to bear. It's more compelling by virtue of its necessity, certainly to us today, all so obsessed with performance. I don't know why Kohlhaas decided to stack plans in a time travel through the history of architecture. It may not have been necessary. I love it nonetheless. Still, always we were looking for a reason to do things. Now, what happens in this particular case is that we're in California. Smart growth dominates here, and environmental protection is the main task to confront. And this site almost unbuildable. The reason the architect, this client came to me is that it was an almost insoluble problem. My favorite matters in architecture are the nearly insoluble. Tel Aviv square, rectangle now is in a triangle. And here, a site completely impossible to confront. In fact, the only empty site in the development is 20 years old. The owners for 10 years gone through 3 architects and I think 6 failed efforts to get a house design approved for the site. I went through 3 and made it on the 3rd. And this is the one we're going to build. there were many reasons for the difficulties. There were cut and fill limitations, and drainage questions, and fire, how many trees get saved, and it's an endless number of constraints. So this house does something didactic and simple to deal with all of that. First, it has to somehow be parallel to the topographic development of the site, so as not to require too much cutting. But in doing so, wherever we would put it, the driveway would get too long, the axis by means of fire trucks and automobiles would require too much filling and too much impervious surface driveway area. So it had to be too close to the street, which meant that it would kill too many trees because most of them were up there. It's just like that, a push and pull between different demands. And the house folds to save the tree protection zones to the greatest possible degree, the best of those trees. But there was yet another requirement. This is the most kind of ridiculous in a way, which was that certain houses, and this was one of them, certain sites, were required to lay very low, their houses were, owing to the views others' houses had, and owing to protecting the appearance of this hillside from the city. No higher than, 18 feet at any point, and cumulatively no higher than 28 in total. So the house is literally forced to lie down on, let's say, be projected down, as it were. So here we have the formation of this bent and low-lying form. You can see in a way implicitly that it is thereby sandwiched between a virtual surface, like the topographic one, and the real one, the ground. And this shape, this V, will be very important. Now we're starting at the top, and it's some kind of house. In California, often you start at the top and move down if it happens or on that kind of lot. So we come in, we bypass these, the bedroom, the master bedroom, and descend a stair that leads into this main plan of rooms, which themselves are gradually descending. And finally, watch the whole plan slide down the hill. So from the top to the bottom, you see the kind of migration of some bedrooms at the lowest. But the most interesting thing happens vis-a-vis this question of how this form deals with the development of these plans that are, in a way, as a kind of way as plans tend to be. Here we have this, yes, as I said, the V shape. It's intersecting the ground, and it comes to an apex here. As you can see, this kind of parallelogram shape is a bit of an obsession, not unlike the facade of Tel Aviv, and certainly like the house that was based on the Bezar investigations. So we have this parallelogram-shaped facades, the bottom and the top being parallel. Sorry, I'm not reminded of my hand here. It also implicitly suggests, by the way, that this building split open, folded open. This is a gable. What could be more ubiquitous for a domestic piece of architecture than the gable form strung out like that? I should show you probably what is its precedence, the low house of McKinney and White. The gable form, of course, a continuous obsession of any architect who is interested in the ubiquitous, the normative for the house. There's that apex, that V, the ground coming all the way up into this point. And we cut it out here. A retaining wall, allowing this side of the house to communicate with that side across a half courtyard. But this turns out to be not the ground, but rather a green roof, actually. This hovers above a space. As the plans move down the hill and slide one out from the other, like doors in a way, they end up descending obliquely below the oblique of the form of the exterior itself. The exterior presents itself almost as an autonomous phenomenon. It's not unlike the light fall in relation to the galleries around it. Look at the way the ceiling here, like, let's say, a datum defined by something liquid, like a water plane. whips around this V. The building has fallen to the ground, and in its rigidity, its unyielding nature, lifts itself up as well as falls down beyond what is inside of it. No matter that rather normative things happen inside, these episodes of extreme disagreement between the internal configuration and the oblique facade are interesting. And here, the only moment where I can make some comment about something that I could justify via kind of Losian sensibility, the house utterly disappears. It's like any other typical house in California. This is the front. My friends, my architectural friends, can't believe I would do something so bad. I don't care what it looks like. I'm only interested in what it actually is doing. It doesn't matter that it looks like nothing. It's exciting that the geometry is forced into this figure. Here, a kind of Desarguian Bramantian problem. This is a project in New York City, very near Ground Zero. A public passage between two very large buildings that would have been mere alley relegated to the status of some kind of residual space, but for the fact that the city has required that rather than West Street be the main means of pedestrian movement, it be one half block to the west, which is here in Artery. It's impossible. I wish I had a pointer, but anyway. To the west of the West Side Highway is a pedestrian kind of path, and this would momentarily have to be productive of commerce there. There it is wedged between what was a very ugly hotel, a red brick and glass building on the right, far right, and this tower for Goldman Sachs. It tries to produce a kind of provisional interior-like space by putting a ceiling over it rather than leaving it only a canyon. As I said, a residual canyon. It will create a kind of luminous quality. Luckily, the plan of this alley was dented. If it weren't for the fact that the plan bent, I would have to have volunteered to generate something of interest for myself, but happily I didn't need to. It was given to me. And by virtue of this bend, the normal form for the canopy was constrained. If we were to imagine that normally we would have had that kind of canopy, which is something almost here represented like a drawbridge letting itself down, and not getting to go all the way down because it hits what's across from it. And then stretching and trying to encompass this space, well, stopped by that corner, the corner that folds opposite the tower. It creases this way. These three planes manifest very hyperbola. They're, as it were, kind of discretized. It's a hyperbola revolution and discretized into three independent triangles. And these bends and these lineaments are inextricably related to the particular conditions of this context, the bent path. Most exciting being the kind of tectonic implication that this 375-foot long line called the Big Diagonal, this is what we call it, is stopped literally by the vertical by that corner on the left of the tower. This building on the left, is on the tower. I don't know what to call it other than a bad building on the left. Imagine it as a kind of intrusive and uninvited guest into this what would have been very lovely open space. Had it not been there, the canopy would have been let down. This would have been the porte cochere, the entry to the wonderful new headquarters. It's as if somehow it has been given more presence as something, an obstacle course, as something that proceeds to squeeze this space not an inert and hideous building, but something that acts on the space by virtue of this canopy. That enactment is embodied, that is, that it is a piece that resists the normal development of this canopy that leans on it. Makes it all the more important rather than merely a negative presence. Here you can see how it does produce this kind of revisional interiority, atrium-like along this artery. This being an episode unique, distinguished along the whole of the west side, the only interiorized, the only not enclosed arterial arcade in the land. Hopefully an episode which will garner some attention, as does what happens north of it, the now most famous of all public spaces in New York, IoA. Last project. This is a library, a lower right corner, ugly drawing of what actually is not a bad master plan, though it looks bad. This I don't need to reflect back on plant types. I think they're pretty clear. It's a more regulated version of the spiral continuous form. It turns out that there is an analogy made between the atrium and the courtyard. Inverse each other. But the whole of the building, expectedly almost cubic, rightfully for a library, let's say, but torqued for reasons you might be asked about, and don't ask me, and I won't be able to answer, other than to say that it's by some impulse to animate the inanimate. Constrained, again, we can see the unyielding nature of these edges of these surfaces. The straight line that originates at that corner and goes all the way to the opposite end. You can see it on the left. Right down on point, or it will turn and slide. Anyway, this kind of tension manifests itself in the structure, and here we see this winding, this Guggenheimish library. People can peruse it as they move through and sit on fold-down benches. These are for books that are not part of any permanent collection. They're disposable, just everyday use books, commercial almost. This is not going to be a bookstore, but this is the atrium now, and the courtyard, flattened version where the landscape in its multicolor composition is something like the multicolored books on their shelves. Smashed flat. One of the most interesting things about this building is the way the landscape, the building is not only producing its effects of torsion by means of its facade, by means of the envelope, but also by means of distortions of the landscape. The landscape rises and falls as if the building is in a kind of wake of its own making through its motion through the landscape. And the building itself foregrounds itself. You can see here in this whole low-lying part seems to be foregrounding almost what appears to be another building behind it. The building is kind of accretive and effective in terms of its context. That landscape not yet built here, but you will see. You can see what will happen. That is, really didn't really have a conclusion. I could make one of those grand statements about why it's important to think about the relationship between drawing and urbanism. I'd really rather, if you have questions, have that be the means to proceed at all. Thank you so much for coming.
would you explain your design process? I mean, a small practice working with such a project.
Okay. Well, the process of design arises through strange experiments with disagreeing geometries and plans that don't fit, and all kinds of things like this. I mean, looking for the problematic of the site, and this, like the neuroses of the client. Well, let's say the conflicting desires of the client, and coming to know that client at a deep level is really significant, particularly in the case of the house. I didn't show a house in upstate New York and in the museum in Israel. The clients were extremely involved in particular kinds of obsessions. The development of the integrity of the galleries, for example, and the quality of light in them was and the questions of maintenance and all sorts of things of that nature. I think that were absolutely in the case of the television project. And in the New York project, a client who at Goldman Sachs would ask questions like, how few lines could we have and still see the curve? This was literally an ethos of the economy, the greatest effect from these needs possible. And he was very conservative and very critical and detail-oriented person, Tim Ordale. Anyway, the brilliance, the involvement, the obsessiveness of the client is a big part of the process. Okay, now, to get to the question of the size of the office. I mean, I guess the only answer I would give you is that each project has a very intense and close-knit team. So in Tel Aviv, we never had more than 4 people full-time working on it at any given time. That entire project, I was kind of amazed as I walked in. Honestly, this is true. I walked into a project, I went to visit the Herzog and Iran office, and I saw a project about the same size, slightly less complicated, with a team of, I think it was 12. And actually, I couldn't imagine employing that many people. I couldn't figure out how I could make 12 people do what we were doing before. So, it's kind of an odd thing. It really involved very close working with the project architect, in this case, Amit Nimlet, who came to the United States for 2.5 years, continues to work with me on all the projects of Israel. Each one has a very intense involvement of a main kind of person who's sort of acting as project architect. Inside my office, that's the key. Sometimes that person, for a China project, is not really what you would think of as a project architect. It's someone recently graduated who's obsessive in detail and has an extremely skillful way of manipulating the model of the building. The modeling has to be handled very intensely. And we established a relationship with the manufacturer of the facade. Direct relationship, very unusual in China. We did that in Datong, where it was not invited in our contract, but it became possible by virtue of the fact that the local architects couldn't stand it anymore. To a point in time, we exhausted them with our process, and they decided it was just going to be easier to let us deal with the manufacturer. So this line of connection with the manufacturer is key to being able to keep the teams very small. I don't know if that helps. Okay. So many just going to get down to 30 minutes. Okay.
Can you say a little bit about construction issues?
Yes.
We saw a few beautiful sites. I've always thought so much about the work before the skin goes up.
Before the skin comes up, you're talking about the deep structure of the building, the frame, the steel frame.
Yeah, so, I mean, how is that integrated into your meeting?
Well, I guess the best case would be that Tel Aviv, we're able to do something there which you cannot do in China, which is to integrate mechanical systems into the structure. Thread the two through, have mechanical thread I think the way I would say it is that we're probably doing something in the ethos of something like what happened at a very modest scale. So I don't mean to make the association with grandeur. To what happens when Koolhaas, for example, makes this CCTV. He proposes a shape which will demand engineering to solve a problem in a particularly challenging way, a way which will ultimately inflect the interior at a deep level. So, for example, if these now are trusses that define the walls, all four of the main walls upstairs are totally are giant windows. The behavior of the Verandale in all of its dimensions had a great deal to do where we put the thresholds to cross through these Verandales because the bottom of the Verandale was above the floor. Anyway, the engineer had to modify the ends of the Verandale, and we had to locate our thresholds at its ends, which transforms the sequence through the building. I'm very interested in this kind of dialectic, where the actual behavior of the plan is also authorized in part by a challenge I posed earlier to an engineer who then, through the negotiation, forces back on me a modified response to that. I think in other cases, it's well, in the canopy in New York, for example, there are tension cables. This whole structure is hanging off only one side. It's not actually, as it appeared there, related or connected to the red brick building. In fact, it stays away from it a few inches. It's not allowed to touch it. This is a matter having to do with the two properties and leases that are held by the two. But anyway, it hangs, and there's cables by virtue of the shape of that building and where they attach and all of the rest produce a parabola, by the way. And this was the optimal solution, actually. So there are other coincidental ways that structure are able to, by virtue of watch carefully the behavior of structure and form, and geometry, produce, exponentially generate architecture. So it's an interesting dialogue between, I think, structure and some and not them, some more than others. Yes.
Thank you very much. You start to talk in the introduction something about urbanism, and you kind of start, and somehow it seemed like there was a chapter just style that somehow really appeals to see some more. This is an urbanism.
Okay. Well, I guess there were two issues of the urban that I thought were repeated themes, even up to the near end of the talk, up to the point of the canopy in New York. One would be the way in which the plan of the city determines, well, ultimately the shape of the building. And that this shaping force, the city acting on the building, can be geometrically, significantly, powerful with the development of the plan of the interior. And of course, finally, more important than that the city is what preconditions the plan type that I regard to be most important, successive plan. The stacking of plans in, well, mainly in I showed it, the skyscraper, as opposed to the way they piled up in the pre-modern period hierarchically with diminishing significance as they got, is one which challenges the questions of hierarchy and distinctions between plans one to the next and such matters as that. Karlsruhe and Tel Aviv try to articulate that problem of piling. They try to make evident, they reflect on what is preconditioned by the city, that is, that particular type of planning. They give a special or spatial experience to what is normally ubiquitously unrecognized, which is, as I said, is preconditioned by the city, by the modern city. That's not the same as the generator plan of Producer, which I don't argue to be preconditioned by the urban. I don't actually think the anatomical plan is preconditioned by urbanity, by any particular form of urbanity. Only the successive plan, only sleep. Sleep and Legité, I think, are both urban. That's what I'm arguing. So there's urbanity. Both of those are being, both in the the repeated reference I make to the way in Vermonte the city thwarts architecture, the realization of architecture is thwarted by the city and by the modern city, the planning of the modern city. I don't think in my last building, for example, that Tong project, you could say there's any particular way of arguing the connection. You're right. But I think even the house in California and certainly the canopies, the television, are all caught in these questions of constraint and this, whatever that is, that's urban phenomenon. Okay, listen, thank you so much for your attention.